My name is Aaron Shakow, and I'm the director of the Initiative on Healing and Humanity at Harvard Medical School. My program creates public health projects that draw on the humanities and social sciences to improve frontline healthcare delivery. I'm also a historian with a particular interest in the political economy of illness and well-being. Many thanks to the Activist History Review for sponsoring this Q&A. In our country, we're facing two crises at once. 4,000 people are dying every 24 hours. Meanwhile, armed militias just tried to invade our seat of government. The question is, are these emergencies related? Is there a connection between the epidemic and the outbreak of violent authoritarianism in the same demos? What can we learn from the history of epidemics about how to confront such a synergy of plagues? It does seem likely to me that the two crises are connected. To explain why, let me make 2 points. Then I'll close with a modest suggestion. First point, epidemics are never just about illness. The medical historian Charles Rosenberg called them a transverse section through society. He meant that when communities are forced to confront mass sickness and mortality, a lot of previously hidden institutional and cultural realities are exposed. But there's another more specific way that epidemics are about the society as much as the illness. I'm referring to quarantine, what we call in the current American context, lockdown. Lockdowns are not just a recent phenomenon. They're a very ancient precedents. But over the past few hundred years, they've become one of the key ways for countries to maintain their borders in the face of global capitalism. They also transformed how states were governed internally. As we've seen in the last year, lockdowns not only decrease the risk of infection, they create powerful social distinctions through coercive biopolitics. They also contribute to what I describe in my own work as epidemic consciousness. The authoritarian movement that invaded the Capitol last week was marked by both of these features of epidemics. How? To begin with, quarantines create a lot of opportunities for disaster capitalism. Governments dispense with the usual procurement rules and buy life-saving commodities like ventilators for many times their actual value, usually from people connected with the party in power. Meanwhile, in an economic downturn that literally comes overnight with the interruption of trade, some people will be forced to sell their commodities for very little, especially labor. Propping up these abusive economic relationships promotes authoritarianism, the politics of impunity. Just to give one recent example, the former chief of staff of the Occupational Safety and Health Administration told NPR this week that under normal circumstances, OSHA would have done 10,000 workplace inspections during an epidemic like the current one. Yet, despite numerous complaints, they've only done about 200 since March. So many so-called essential workplaces like meatpacking plants have terrifying levels of sickness and death among their employees with no government authority checking up on them. Trump's dismantling of regulatory oversight in the face of the coronavirus epidemic put an exclamation point on long-standing trends in American society. Much of our recent economic policy has been driven by the movement to promote racialized authoritarianism under the fig leaf of disinterested research. But to defend disaster capitalism in the middle of an epidemic, one needs reactionary movements like the one that's trying to keep Trump in power. Total lack of responsiveness to life and death needs cannot be sustained under representative government, where all votes are counted and all lives are valued. The second point I want to make is that popular understandings of epidemics are inherently conflictual. By definition, an epidemic is an illness where many people get sick at the same time. But even people who agree on the key symptoms routinely disagree about why different people fell ill. Given a page full of dots, how do you connect them? Epidemics inspire inferential thinking, and this leads people who understand causation differently to perceive epidemics differently. The conflicts come about because causal reasoning in epidemics is structured by authority, by power. Whose expertise do you accept in a situation where you can't see the contagion that might kill you? There's also a negative feedback loop because in a crisis of mass mortality, it's hard to feel connected to people who disagree with you about basic matters of life and death. Such conflicts, or normative inversions, are another key feature of epidemic consciousness, and they had a big hand on the assault on Congress last week. Many people remarked over the past few days on the connection between the insurgency and white evangelical Christianity. One of the main militias that organized it stopped outside the Capitol to kneel in the street and pray in the name of Jesus. Others have observed an association between membership in white evangelical churches or Hasidic synagogues and rejection of epidemic control strategies like mask mandates and restrictions on public gatherings. What I'm arguing is that the two patterns are connected, that the authoritarianism we saw at the Capitol last week so violently was rooted in a specific epidemic consciousness. Some of this is the product of recent history. As Kevin Kruse has shown, corporate America began cultivating pastors who embraced the so-called prosperity gospel as early as the 1930s, a relationship that Trump exploited in pushing to open the economy with no regulatory oversight. But there's also an ancient history at play that's of great cultural significance to the churches in question, but not very well understood or appreciated outside them. Like Judaism before it, early Christianity paid a lot of attention to epidemics. Its key texts had harsh words for the practice by all sacrificial religions, including both so-called pagans and Jews, of distancing living people from sick and dying ones. This polemic is summed up by St. Ambrose's claim that the biblical prohibition on touching people with leprosy had been rendered null and void by Jesus Christ. The law of Moses forbids touching lepers. Since God is law, however, he does not observe the law, but rather makes it. Leprosy, which normally contaminates by touch, is put to flight by the touch of God. At the Capitol last week, we saw this symbolic norm breaking in action 1,600 years after it was written down. It gave license to invade the temple of an ideology that Ambrose could never have imagined, pro-quarantine secularist egalitarians, with the assistance of other social institutions very far from his experience, white supremacists and corporations. But there is a telling historical irony of the current political struggle. Quarantines were originally invented by what we would call the religious right. In his popular 1662 public health manual, for example, Father Maurice of Toulon gave the following rationale for quarantine. Ships carry plague-ridden merchandise from North Africa, he said, where there is always plague, for those barbarous people take no measures against the plague, which is therefore epidemic. His paranoid explanation for this causal inference sounds like something straight out of InfoWars. They are the enemies of our religion and eager for our possessions. After they have received huge sums of gold and silver brought by our ships, they want us to die of the plague that we carry with their goods. Father Maurice recommended that France should conduct its trade only with Christian countries, which made little sense given the deep economic and family ties between France and Muslim-ruled countries. Father Maurice persisted in urging the conquest of Algiers, Tunis, and Tripoli to exterminate this sect of Mahomet. Well, this sounds pretty familiar. White Christian supremacists using the supposed threat of plague as a lever to redraw the commercial, social, and political map, establish colonial rule, and wipe out their enemies. Their strategy depended on the police established in the cities in times of plague. Countries ruled by these agencies could interact freely, the way St. Augustine envisioned. But those that did not were first to be cut off and then conquered. But I want to point out that there's another inversion going on here. Although the medical police of Father Maurice paved the way for modern police agencies, whose officers collaborated with insurgents at the Capitol, the strategy of conquest that I've just described is also the nightmare of the authoritarian right, who are afraid it will be deployed against them. Right-wing fears about the use of plague control as a pretext for conquest are heightened by folks who call Trump's supporters fascists. This, like terrorism discourse, is an essentially epidemiological analysis that sees white supremacy as a specific disease entity to be stamped out, rather than the product of structural factors that must be addressed more broadly. In the current double-edged national emergency, public health measures like social distancing and anti-fascism seem completely rational. By contrast, it's hard to take the concerns of white supremacist evangelicals seriously. Either they're in bad faith, or they reflect a pathogenic consciousness that has to be stamped out for the well-being of the body politic. Yet, if we take their words at face value, it would appear that the assault on the Capitol was driven not only by a desire for power, but also by a terror of extinction. European settler colonialism has a long and violent history. The white supremacist attack on the US Capitol building is only its latest chapter. From the standpoint of thinking about epidemics, it's essentially a history of inversions, Jewish and pagan, pagan and Christian, Christian and Muslim, Islam and enslavement, enslavement and liberal imperialism, imperialism and neoliberalism. The current anti-fascist epidemiology may just be another inversion of colonial rhetoric. But while it's typical of epidemic consciousness, any social thinking that depends on inversion is inherently violent. The challenge for us, in my opinion, is how to address the double epidemic of coronavirus and white supremacist authoritarianism without appealing to similarly violent emergency powers. Can we mobilize a social vision that draws on the same cultural legacy as quarantine, but focuses not on separation, but rather on shared understanding and mutual aid?